less expected king will contribute to the magnificence of the castle, the Sun King, a monarch whose presence in Fontainebleau is almost forgotten.
Contrary to what is often said, Louis XIV was very present at Fontainebleau. It is a little surprising, in fact, because we know that the court, at the request of the king, settled in Versailles.
And it simply isn't the case that Versailles was his only residence.
According to the experts, the Sun King is even the king who spent the most time in Fontainebleau. It was there that he signed an historic act, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, a decision that once again banned Protestantism in the kingdom. It was also there that he found refuge during the construction of Versailles.
It becomes a residence that allows the whole court to get out of Versailles.
In Fontainebleau, Louis XIV found a residence worthy of his court. The accommodation is grandiose, the communal rooms functional and comfortable. However, the Sun King lacks a large French-style garden. In 1660, he entrusted landscape architect André Le Nôtre with the creation of the Grand Parterre. The king's gardener inherits a difficult task.
He was an experienced gardener who had already started to work to create the perspectives of Versailles, who created the perspectives of Vaux-le-Vicomte. His goal will be to unify all these series of gardens that have been created by Francis I and Henry IV, and that was a new garden.
So how can you create a French formal garden from a closed space surrounded by walls?
They'll open it, they'll make the walls disappear, they'll connect the garden to its environment.
The landscape gardener decided to open and redraw all the flower beds in line with the Grand Canal. A brilliant idea that creates a spectacular perspective.
It's a perspective that goes as far as the Seine. It's really the backbone of the landscaping system wanted by André Le Nôtre, and he takes advantage of it to connect the French garden that he creates with the Grand Canal that had been built 50 years earlier under the reign of Henry IV.
With tenacity, André Le Nôtre succeeded in turning an unreadable garden into a true work of art.
It takes all Le Nôtre's talent to set up a series of false axes, elements that go sideways, a trapezoid that succeeds in making people believe that it's a square. In other words, all these elements are like illusions.
It's in this whole way of seeing, reconfiguring, redeveloping the landscape, and reconnecting with the forest that is everywhere, that we can find André Le Nôtre's genius.
The flower bed, once decorated with boxwood embroidery, reaches unprecedented proportions. Its 4 compartments each cover 8,300 square meters.
This is a work that will come before the creation of the parterres of Versailles. But the parterres of Versailles were never as big as the ones in Fontainebleau.
It's spectacular. It's never been created with these dimensions before. They are forced gradually to abandon the use of boxwood and embroidery because it represents too much work and because ultimately the scale exceeds the human capacity to maintain them.
Today, with his 14 hectares of land, André Le Nôtre's work is still the largest in Europe. Thanks to his French formal gardens, his trademark, Louis XIV left a strong mark on Fontainebleau, even if he does not touch the buildings of what he considers to be a family house.
It's a house you inherit from your father or grandfather, and when you inherit something of this nature, a heritage property, a family property, you're committed to preserving it. This is exactly the guiding principle of Fontainebleau. It is the family home of the kings of France. You don't wipe out the memory of the family home of the kings of France.
Each generation has written its history by reusing the legacy of past generations. And this is what makes Fontainebleau so powerful and so interesting.
The Sun King makes great use of what his ancestors left him. In particular, the horseshoe staircase, inherited from his father, King Louis XIII. A monumental work in a totally new form that replaces an obsolete staircase.
The
staircase, which was built in the 1630s, is much larger and more impressive than the first staircase. I think there is a functional reason for this demolition. It's that they wanted to allow vehicles, that is to say carriages, to be able to reach the foot of the stairs.
Thanks to its height and new shape, the carriages can now deposit the royals directly at the foot of the double flight of steps before turning around under the arches. Therefore, a more ingenious staircase, and in particular twice as big as the previous one. An exceptional footprint, 21 meters long and 21 meters wide.
It could almost have been housed inside the current staircase. There is quite a significant difference in proportions between the two.
The horseshoe staircase will allow the Sun King to stage his entries and exits from Fontainebleau in a theatrical way. Over the centuries, thanks to the contributions of the Bourbons, the great residence of the kings has held up well, at least until 1789 and the French Revolution. Fontainebleau then came close to demolition.
We even have plans for, quite terrifying when we think about it today, of the complete destruction of the royal residence. Since it is ultimately the symbol of the monarchy, there's a risk that one day someone will want to take it back. There are people who want to completely demolish these buildings that have become useless.
In the end, the superstructure, absolute symbol of the monarchy, was spared. Only its furniture is looted. A few years later, an emperor will give it back all its power. When Napoleon I seized power in 1804, he reinvested in the Château of Fontainebleau with one clear goal in mind: to simply place himself in the line of kings of the ancient regime, without attracting the wrath of the people.
I think the reason that Napoleon I chose Fontainebleau rather than Versailles is because Versailles was simply too closely associated with the Ancien Regime. Before the Revolution, Versailles was the enemy personified in bricks and mortar and marble.
But when he arrives in Fontainebleau, Napoleon inherits an empty and pitiful castle. He then relies on his official architects, Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, also the architects of the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, to revive the building.
Napoleon is very important in the history of the castle, because not only does he have it refurbished, but it can be said to have saved it. Because if Napoleon had not been interested in Fontainebleau, if he had not decided to make it a residence of power again, what would have become of the castle?
Napoleon was all the more eager to restore Fontainebleau because he intended to invite Pope Pius VII to it on the occasion of his coronation in 1804.
The refurnishing had to be done in an absolute frenzy, with carts of furniture that arrived from Paris which made it possible to refurnish the castle.
This tour de force, a real miracle, was achieved by reinstalling, recreating apartments in this house, taking furniture from the cabinet makers who ordered them and recreating sublime apartments in record time. 19 days, they say at the time, to welcome the Pope.
But Napoleon did not stop there. If Fontainebleau is to embody the empire, it must be sealed with his seal. In 1808, he ordered the creation of his throne room in place of the king's room.
Under the Empire, Napoleon didn't want to reuse the room of his predecessors. He wanted to show that there was a definitive change, which was the change the Revolution brought, so it was no longer a question of reusing the royal ceremonial. The bed is removed, but symbolically the throne is installed in its place, which is to say, the very symbol of his own power. Fontainebleau is not a summer residence. It is not a second residence. It is a place where he will be able to exercise the fullness of power. The presence of the throne room is what that implies.
During his reign, Napoleon I welcomed all the crowned heads of Europe to this room. Today it is the only one in France preserved in its historical state and with its original furniture. The emperor is also the last occupant of the castle to change its orientation. For him who wants to stand out from the Bourbons, the main entrance must face the city, the people. He had a wing of the Court of Honor, which was created 300 years earlier, destroyed and replaced with a majestic gate, which he fashioned in his glory.
On the gate, we find the N of the crowned emperor. The eagles that are on either side of the front door. And then there is Jupiter's lightning also, Napoleon effectively assimilating Jupiter's power.
But the glory and power displayed at the entrance of the palace will not be enough to protect the emperor from his setbacks during the campaigns of Russia and Central Europe.
Fontainebleau is the last refuge of Napoleon in a France completely besieged and invaded by foreign troops.
Forced to abdicate, it was at Fontainebleau that Napoleon bid farewell to France before leaving for the island of Elba on April 20th, 1814.
The troops are in line, waiting for the emperor. The emperor arrives with his hat in his hand, puts on his hat, kisses the flag, and addresses his old guard in extremely moving terms.
Goodbye, my children. I would like to press you all to my heart, that I at least kiss your flag. Napoleon will have definitely left his mark in Fontainebleau, even if he only spent a short time there, less than 6 months, too busy on the battlefield. But a few decades later, Napoleon III, who was crowned emperor in 1852 after his coup d'etat, would continue his uncle's work. He resides mainly in Paris at the Palais des Tuileries. However, he could not abandon Fontainebleau. The castle is part of his heritage.
I think in his mind, it was important to strengthen the dynastic associations that he had with his uncle, because Napoleon I was closely associated with the Château of Fontainebleau, and Napoleon III wanted that association to be preeminent in the public mind.
From 1857 onwards, Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie spent their summers in Fontainebleau. The castle is prestigious, enough to receive the Parisian court, but not only.
Like all the rulers, Napoleon III used the castle of Fontainebleau as a tool of his diplomacy. He received in this residence many crowned heads from all over the world.
A problem. Fontainebleau lacks a theater. However, for the emperor, who will order the construction of Opéra Garnier, it is not a luxury but a strategic piece of his diplomacy. In 1854, Napoleon III entrusted this task to Hector Le Fuel, one of the Louvre's architects.
The theatre of Napoleon III and Eugénie in Fontainebleau was created in the euphoria of the beginning of Napoleon III's reign, at the time when the empire was being established, when a court society was being rebuilt after the episode of the 1848 revolution.
But where to create a 400-seat theatre in Fontainebleau and quickly, because the emperor is in a hurry? The architect will have to take up the challenge. The emperor's trusted man has a surprising idea. Instead of building a new building, he wants to use a wing of the main courtyard in which to insert his work.
From the moment the building existed, it was easier to free yourself from the foundation questions and all of these things. The architect designed several theatre projects, which were rather difficult to design given the short distance between the facades. Theatres in the 19th century were generally relatively large.
Finally, in a building only 14 meters wide, the architect succeeded in not only creating the stage, but also an oval room large enough to accommodate the court and its guests. He managed to insert a circle into a square.
So the insertion into the wing was complicated. First, because of the relatively narrow structure, and then because of the different levels that had to be installed. Obviously, respecting the ground level and the roof, the wing was completely emptied and the roof removed, and from that moment on, they were able to rebuild the theatre inside these two facades.
He managed to shoehorn a really very small theater into a wing of the chateau without changing the envelope, the outside. You'd never know there's a theater in there until you open the door and go in.
The result, a richly decorated hall 42 meters long by 14 meters wide, with a capacity of 430 spectators.
What is extraordinary is that this room was created by Hector Lefeuille in record time. We're talking about a year and a half. People worked day and night.
Inaugurated in 1857 for the arrival of the Grand Duke Constantine of Russia, they will say of this room that it was one of the most elegant that one can dream of, a real jewel. Over time, the small hunting lodge in Fontainebleau has been transformed into a sprawling palace with gigantic galleries, 4 courtyards, an impressive canal, the largest parterre in Europe, and a private theater. The castle housed all the crowned heads of France. From Saint Louis to the Bonapartes, it has established itself as an instrument of royal and imperial power. Napoleon I renamed it the true residence of the kings, the house of the centuries.